Hi, everybody. I'm really pleased to welcome Sara Zewde to Georgia Tech. We are so happy you're here with us. Glad you made it out from New York with that massive blizzard. I do want to mention to all of you in the audience that following Sarah's lecture, we will have a reception in the West Architecture Building. It's not pizza, so applause for that. Before I introduce Sara, though, I do want to talk a little bit about the history about the Douglas E. Allen Lecture Series. This is an annual lecture series that was established and endowed by alumni, faculty, and friends in honor of Doug Allen. This is, I think, if my math is correct, Kathy, you will have to correct me. I think this is the 19th anniversary of the Doug Allen Lecture. With that, I want to give a special welcome to Kathy Allen, who's joining us here and who's come to all the lectures since we started. So Doug Allen, I actually never met Doug Allen, but what's interesting is if you flash back to the year 2000, I happened to cross paths with two people who knew Doug well as former students. They studied under him here at Georgia Tech, about 10 years apart. But what was interesting is that when they would talk about their experiences at Georgia Tech, they would always talk about like, oh, and Doug Allen, he was such an amazing professor, such a great teacher and mentor, so impactful, inspiring. And that was really interesting. So I feel like I got to know Doug through both of them. One of them has remained in teaching, and I was just speaking with him not too long ago, and he talked about how he continues to share Doug's lessons that he himself learned under Doug, and so he's continuing to pay it forward. So the legacy and generosity of Doug and his teaching continues even now. So even though I never met him, I don't have any of my own memories to share. I think what is really impactful is when I went back and getting ready for this lecture today, I mean, Doug's career spanned 30 years, and he introduced thousands of architecture students to the history and design of landscapes and of cities. And more importantly, to that kind of really inextricable bond between architecture and urban design, starting the history of urban form class, which continues as an important part of our Master of Architecture curriculum today. So really happy about that. Speaking of impact, colleagues and students and friends started the Doug Allen Institute. I'd like to actually invite Bill Haley to come up now and say a few words about that.
Well, hello. It's a nice crowd. I'm Bill Haley, and the reason I have this connection with Doug, we were roommates in college at the University of Georgia, no booze. Many of you probably have attended one of these before. Occasionally I've stepped up on the stage to tell about the Institute. We lived in a building that used to be a church, and we called it a church. And it was a lot of fun. We got a lot of attention with it. And they even wrote us up in the Atlanta paper in what back then was called the Dixie Living section. And they paid us a sort of a compliment one time. You can decide whether you think it was a compliment. We had rigged up the inside of the church in our apartment. It was described as a dime store version of the Playboy Mansion. So, but we thought we were cool. Anyway, I've said about Doug before, he was a great friend. He was a great intellectual, and he was a great teacher. And I'm so proud of him. I'm so honored to be able to step up here and talk about him. We did remain friends until his death after school, lived in the same neighborhood, and got together all the time. The lecture itself is a tribute to Doug. The Douglas C. Allen Institute for the Study of Cities is something that we created to honor Doug and foster his knowledge. We have the lectures, the History of Urban Form lectures, and we are developing those. It's taken a long time because people like me don't have any idea how to do it, but work is being done. Now you can see in the current state, they are lectures by going online. And I'm going to offer this to you. If you would like to go and look, you can poke around. There are a lot of lectures, and they're all about 40 or so minutes long because they were classes. They're the actual recordings of Doug in the class with slides that go with it. It's not in final form, but it's quite enjoyable to see and quite intellectual and enlightening. I'm going to give you my email address. And if you email me, put anything you want in, but be sure and put DCAI in the title. And you can put lecture there if you want to, but if you put DCAI, I'll know it's not a scam. And I will send you back a link to the lectures. And you can look at them at your leisure. You can go right there and take a look at them. The other thing that I would like to report on is years ago, a student support fund was set up at the University of Georgia involving some of us to honor Doug in his honor. And we're going to do it here too. And we've committed now to a matching contribution up to a point of at least enough to make it official. You know, the school won't let you start one with $25. So you have to put enough money in so it's worth their while. But we're committed to that, and the school will run it. Julie and others will be in charge of it. I won't have anything to do with it, but I alert you to be on the lookout for it and take that opportunity. The matching gift will be there long enough to get us into the threshold for the student support fund or scholarship fund, however the money is chosen to be handed out, to be official and permanent, to be a permanent endowment. So we're proud to have done that. Again, I'm so honored to have the opportunity to come here and speak to you guys. Bunch of smart kids, got your great futures coming to you. I'm really jealous. I'm a retired attorney. I get up in the morning and sort of like when I was in undergraduate school, every day is Saturday. So thank you for letting me come up here today, and thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Bill. Speaking of scam, as you were speaking, I had a scam call come into my phone. All right, architecture and landscape. I think one of the things I really appreciate about this particular lecture is that it allows us to gather around a conversation that sits really close to the way that I think about design. I don't think about design as something that is mutually exclusive or just a singular thing, or as a separate set of disciplines, but it's a continuum. And there are so many different ways in which we can think about design and architecture and landscape. And so for me, they've never been seen as different or distinct territories. They meet at a shared ground. Really, quite literally, they meet at the ground. I've always been interested where that moment where the building meets the earth. For students, I've always talked about, think about how your building touches the ground. How does the material meet the topography? Where does a threshold become spatial? Maybe it's about a wall and how it extends into a garden, or how a courtyard might become a microclimate, or a piece of infrastructure becomes a civic landscape. And so when we think about architecture and landscape in those terms, it becomes quite broad, right? And really rich and amazing. And so then it's like, you're not asking the question, is this architecture or is this landscape? You're just thinking about what are the kinds of spatial experiences that we're designing and who are we designing those for? And I think thinking about it in this way asks us to move beyond objects that sit on the earth. Some of you may have heard me say, you know, our buildings do not exist in splendid isolation, but it's between built form and terrain, between systems and our experiences, between the human intention and the larger context. And so I think that's one of the things that is really amazing when I look at Sara's work, is her work speaks about this in so many different ways and across scales. And how, when we think about this conversation of architecture and landscape, it's about how are we participating in social, ecological, and cultural networks. And so I think that when we consider architecture and landscape together, I think we gain in that kind of capacity to make places that are even more generous, that are even more deeply attuned to aspects of community and of culture and of place. And so I think that Sara's lecture today will be an invitation to think about that shared field, to think about architecture as landscape, and as landscape as architecture, because there's that kind of wonderful space where they overlap. And it's in that overlap that we find all kinds of new possibilities. So now I want to introduce Sara. Sara Zewde is founding principal of Studio Zewde, a design firm practicing landscape architecture, urbanism, and public art. Named to Time Magazine's Time 100 Next, Architectural Digest AD 100, and a United States Artist Fellow, her practice is celebrated for its design methods that sync culture, ecology, and craft. In parallel to her design practice, Sara also serves as an associate professor of practice at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. Sara holds a Master's of Landscape Architecture from the GSD, a Master of City Planning from MIT, and a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and Statistics from Boston University. She's currently writing a book about Frederick Law Olmsted's travels through the Slave South, which is slated to be published by Simon & Schuster in 2027. I've already added this to my list of things that I need to purchase. After Sara speaks, she'll be joined on stage by Ellen Dunham-Jones, who will lead a conversation with her, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So now, with that, please join me with a very warm welcome to Sara.
Thank you so much for inviting me here today. I'm born and raised in Houston, and my sister went to Emory twice. So I've actually spent some time in Atlanta, and it's really great to be back. It's great to not be in a blizzard in New York and Boston right now. And my regards to Doug Allen's friends and family that are here today. And I'm just so honored to be welcomed here. So a little bit about myself, as I mentioned, I was born and raised in Houston. Actually, half of my childhood was spent in Louisiana. So I consider myself very much of the Gulf Coast region. And I was in college when this storm event brewed and barreled in the Gulf of Mexico and towards my home state of Louisiana. And I was an undeclared major. So if you're already in the College of Design and as an undergrad, you're well ahead of where I was at your age. And it was really, this was the first week of my sophomore year when this happened. And I watched from my dorm room in Boston. And it sent me on a search for a discipline that could help me understand how this event could happen, but also how I could understand it less as an event and really as a set of systems that allowed this to happen. Not just it as an acute event, but really its aftermath as well, which continues on into the present. And through that journey of looking for a discipline, I arrived at landscape architecture. And so as my bio kind of references, I am a practitioner, I teach, I write, but these activities for me are not distinct activities. They really come together around the central inquiry that started for me after Hurricane Katrina, looking for ways to understand ecology and culture and craft, understand them as systems, but also understand how to intervene within them. So I'm the principal of Studio Zewde. We are a full-service landscape architecture firm based in Harlem, New York. And, actually we have a native Midtown Atlantan in our office named Allie Duke. She went to UGA, no booze, I guess. But I'm really, proud of the team that we are, coming from a really wide range of professional backgrounds. And we bring, all of the ways of knowing, kind of as Julie mentioned in her intro, into the question of designing spatial experiences. And we go through this really robust kind of conceptual narrative process, which you'll get a sense of a bit today. But for us, it's all about the craft of construction at the end of the day, and designing and building spaces that feel like they belong in their context and make people feel like they belong in them. So all of our big ideas and big thinking really translate to the detail scale, material expression of a place, how two things come together, that even at that scale, we have a really big impact that we can make. I want to start with a little bit of my research. As was mentioned, I've recently submitted a manuscript that will be published next year about Frederick Law Olmsted's time in the antebellum South. Just to get a sense, who's ever heard of Frederick Law Olmsted? Okay, 40%. So Frederick Law Olmsted is considered the father of landscape architecture. He's the first to use the term landscape architect in North America. He designed America's first public park, which is Central Park. And he's one of the most written about people in American history. I'm writing about a 14-month period in his life that's actually under-historicized in all of those books and literature that have been written about him. And it's a time in 1852 to 1853, a little bit in 1854 as well, where he was hired by the fledgling New York Daily Times, today known as the New York Times, in its first year of establishment to travel the slave states and write about the conditions of slavery. And this is before he, quote, invented landscape architecture. I, went to school in the Northeast. I never heard about the South in my own curriculum, only as a what not to do model, largely. And so when I heard that Frederick Law Olmsted, this iconic figure, this hero, the hero of landscape architecture, spent time in the South, I wanted to know more. And I was surprised to find there actually wasn't much written about it. But I was curious if this is what he was doing before designing Central Park and 1,100 parks after that in North America. How did his time in the antebellum South influence his practice? So for the most part, his biography is understood in two distinct chapters, that he was some kind of writer, and then he started landscape architecture. And my hypothesis was I imagined that they couldn't have just been two distinct chapters without influencing one another. So these are a few dates from his biography citing his work writing about the South. And here are some key dates in how we understand his legacy in landscape architecture, starting with Central Park, going on to practice until 1895. That includes work right here in Atlanta, actually towards the end of his professional life. But if we look at this chronology together, we start to see that these actually weren't distinct chapters of his life. In fact, he was going back and forth between thinking and writing about the South and designing public parks all across America. I make the case in the book, by the way, for those that maybe aren't familiar with his legacy, that no one person has shaped the way America looks more than him, just by sheer acreage of what he's designed. And here are a few historic moments that were happening in the backdrop of his professional life that he references in his personal letters that influence his approach to writing and to practice. I'm not the first person actually to make this argument. Charlie Beveridge is considered one of the foremost scholars on Olmsted, and he writes, although Olmsted changed in 5 years from a farmer to a writer and publisher, and then to park designer and administrator, the single problem of slavery dominated his thinking and gave unity to his various activities. So I wanted to know more. Of course, I could spend time with his letters and his archives and read his writing, but I really was interested in the question of how could this influence his design practice. So I spent time in his archives and letters, and I actually retraced his steps through the South. So this is a map that he made, actually. I annotated on top of it the dates and the places that he traveled, but I'll talk a little bit about the drawing that he made underneath in a moment. But this is just to give you a sense of the breadth of his travels, including Georgia. In the middle of his travels, he goes to Rochester, New York, and he witnesses the Colored National Convention, organized by Frederick Douglass and his contemporaries. And this really starts to shape a key kind of takeaway for Olmsted in his travels. And he writes about it in one of the entries. I mean, he writes about it in a lot of entries, but just to give you a peek into his writing for the Times, he starts to think about the North's role in the question of slavery and how the North should create a society that demonstrates why freedom is worth fighting for. That it should be a place where everyone can thrive, and actually that the success of Black people in the North is the true marker of a democracy. And he writes, in fact, it is the duty which lies nearest to us. And he ends this series for the New York Times actually with all capital letters and underlined fair play for the Negro, that being his call. A lot of people, when I present this research, a lot of people ask about Seneca Village. Is anybody familiar with Seneca Village? Okay, it was a 19th century community that was an African American community that was land owning in the antebellum period. And they were located where Central Park is located. So they needed to be removed in order for Central Park to become what we know it to be today. So when I start to talk about my research in Olmsted in the South, a lot of people say, point to this contradiction. And so I also wanted to understand where Olmsted stood in the removal of this important 19th century community. What I learned was that when Olmsted was traveling, it was actually a big question at the time where Central Park would be located. What you see on this drawing are the two options that were up for debate: Jones Park on the East River and Central Park in the center of Manhattan Island. And Olmsted actually, although he was not involved in the siting of the park itself, believed that Jones Park was the premier location right there on the water. It was all owned by one property owner, and it was less difficult to deal with in terms of terrain. Where Central Park is rocky, it was swampy, and that's actually primarily why African Americans were able to locate this community, this thriving community here. It was a function of wanting to remove this Black community and political corruption, and Olmsted called that out. And so he was opposed, in fact, to this location. And the removal of Seneca Village predates his involvement by about 6 years. He comes back from his travels in the South, and there is a design competition for Central Park, an anonymous design competition. He submitted, together with Calvert Vaux, his partner, he actually submitted late. He paid off the janitor of the building to include the number 33 entry out of 33, and his submission won. That is not a takeaway for the students. You should meet all your deadlines. But it's consequential for how we understand the American landscape. And many of his thoughts coming back from the South then get decoded, or he translates his reflections from what he sees in the South into landscape theory and landscape design, and that's really starts at Central Park. During the construction of Central Park, we have a pivotal election in this country, and Abraham Lincoln was elected not by a mandate. And so the question of secession actually emerged following his election. And Olmsted at the time was overseeing the construction of Central Park. And he steps down, in fact, to revisit his writing for the New York Times and rewrite it in a more abolitionist voice. At the time when he was traveling, he was quite naive, and that is very evident in the writing itself. But he wants to come back and rewrite his reflections, thinking that it could help influence global abolitionist movements in view of an impending civil war. And that book would be called The Cotton Kingdom. And he, as part of that publishing, develops this drawing using 1850 census data, essentially trying to make a visual representation of the key argument of the book, which is he's challenging the economic argument for slavery and saying that in places where there are larger concentrations of enslaved people, actually the economy isn't faring as well. There may be a few people that are making a lot of profits, producing, a small number of millionaires. But in terms of an economy, the economic argument that there are hidden inefficiencies in the slave economy. So as part of my research, I retraced his steps through the South, and I'll just quietly share some of the photos from across my travels. Each one of these places tells a story, which is why I realized I needed to write a book. There's no other way to tell you all of this in a lecture. But I'll share one. This is in Savannah. Olmsted came here. He spent a lot of time in African burial grounds. He found those to be particularly important to antebellum life. And here he writes about a burial ground, and he spends time transcribing the headstones of the people interred. And I tried to find this burial ground, and I was really confused when I came here. And this is the burial ground today. At the time, he described it as the outskirts of Savannah. Today, it's in the heart of the city. And there's no marker of the people that lay below. And so it kind of brought to my attention how landscape architecture has been this tool to rewrite and obscure the history of the landscape, which is ironic because the father of the discipline himself wanted to tell other different stories about the landscape. So can this profession that Olmsted founded tell the stories that Olmsted wanted to tell? I ended up finding those headstones that Olmsted transcribed in another part of the city. What I learned about Olmsted emboldened my practice of landscape architecture. And so I want to share a few projects, kind of starting from earlier in my career to more recent, trying to pick a range of scales for you as well. So, and through my practice, really trying to answer the question of whether landscape architecture can tell the stories that Olmsted wanted to tell. So this is a project in Houston, Texas, in Genesee Street in the historic 4th Ward, otherwise known as Freedmantown. And this is the community that was built by free people following emancipation on the banks of the Buffalo Bayou, on a stretch of the banks that were particularly difficult to urbanize, and why it was available at the time to develop by free people. This community became the heart of civic Black Houston, home to teachers, shop owners, lawyers, and doctors. And they built their own homes, their own streets. They made their own bricks to pave the streets, built their own schools, all things that the city of Houston would not do for them. And today, the neighborhood is under threat by virtue of decades of bad urban policy. All of the urban renewal, freeway bisecting the neighborhood, redlining. And today, that pressure is represented by its proximity to downtown Houston. At the time, I was hired by a landscape architecture firm to help them think through their work on Genesee Street, which is a 60-foot wide right-of-way in this neighborhood. On the left, you can kind of see the scale of the historic grid, and on the right, you can see the legacy of urban renewal. Their work was they were upgrading the sewer system, and they needed to do a streetscape for the 60-foot wide right-of-way. At the time, they asked me, they're like, oh, maybe we could do a statue, or maybe we could put African symbols in the paving, and I really wanted more for this story. So I started to research the architectural trajectory of the shotgun homes here, and learned about its roots in West Africa. So this shotgun home has a Yoruba antecedent, and it was brought to Haiti by enslaved people. And following the Haitian Revolution, people brought this architectural type to the bayous to Louisiana, and from there it spread through the bayous of Southeast Texas. And what's distinct about this typology is the short end of the home faces the street. There's this kind of gallery space between the interiors. There are these steps and porches and windows and doors, and that's really where people's most complex memories of this neighborhood lie, is in this kind of gallery space. So I went out and documented the stairs, porches, windows, and doors, while some of the historic structures are still there. Took a look at the paving that the original free people paved, and you can see the pattern along the straightaways is orthogonal, but then in the intersections, they break and make this diamond. shape. And that was intentional. The elders in the community talk about how this is a tradition from West Africa to mark the intersection of spaces of ritual. And so I developed a streetscape design that concentrated the salvageable bricks in the intersections to highlight the intersections of spaces of ritual. Part of the project required a wall here to this school. And instead of a wall, I wanted to propose to create this gallery of panels made of concrete that speak to the essential rhythms and spatial practice of these shotgun homes. So you can see here kind of modeling the shadows created by these cutouts. And I proposed actually forming the concrete using wood panels from the historic structures so that the panels actually, form a grain from those historic structures. The planting itself, mitigates the hot urban heat of Houston, but also speaks to the bayou vegetation that free people came and made a life in. And that's what they got, But you can use the elements of the everyday to story. So this is a project in Philadelphia called Graffiti Pier. We were commissioned by the Delaware River Waterfront Corporation to redesign Pier 18 and Pier 20 on the Delaware River, as well as some of the upland areas. Philadelphia actually invented graffiti. They love to tell us New Yorkers this. So essentially we were hired to, this Pier 18 was a really important part of the development of the culture. What happened was in the 1970s, when coal declined in the state of Pennsylvania, a lot of the infrastructure that was used for coal became prime for the cultivation of this cultural practice. And so Pier 18 was one of those sites until 2010, when something changed our lives forever. Do y'all have any guesses on what happened in 2010 that changed our lives? Something was invented. Okay, Instagram. This place became the most Instagrammed place in Philadelphia. And it made the tension of this place being kind of this refuge for graffiti writers come to the surface. Also, with hundreds of people coming here every day, it became a liability for Conrail, who owns the site. So that's what led to our commissioning. What we told the clients was that we were not going to do public engagement that the public engagement wouldn't be public. Graffiti writers are criminalized for their use of the site. They have day jobs and monikers and government names, and so we wanted to respect that. And so what we did was we got a bar tab from the client, and we met one-on-one with graffiti writers. Some of them sent representatives to us. We received anonymous emails and phone calls, but we really respected the culture, and it was very off the record engagement. And they were all upset because what they heard was that landscape architects were going to make this a park. And what we committed to them was that we're not going to use the word park even, because that generates a kind of image of what this place is and how it should work. What we wanted to design was a publicly accessible place that feels found, and that they were an important part of that. So this just gives you, we couldn't take pictures of any of the people that we talked to. So this is from one of the bars that we were hanging out at. What we told all the graffiti writers is, their main question to us was, why do anything here? And we said, look, if you don't do anything here in 25 years, this site will be. Is there a train? Okay. Okay. If we do nothing here, the train, the site will be inundated by high tides. You know, not a storm event, not just by high tides. And so getting involved in this project and shaping the investment in it is a chance to save Graffiti Pier. So we started to call this the Save Graffiti Pier project. Across all these disparate one-on-one conversations, we asked everybody the same question. We said, what is the best thing that can happen here? And what is the worst thing that can happen here? And we mapped all of that onto this chart. And, you know, the best thing is don't touch it. And the worst thing is that it looks like a new park. This is very hard for a landscape architect to hear, you know. So what we were looking for was, what are the paths forward in this? And we started to identify some emerging themes. And we came back to the graffiti writers and said, okay, we see these patterns in what you were saying. 1, ensuring the continuation and expansion of art. 2, keeping the site vegetated and passive. 3, make it safe and accessible without looking safe and accessible. And 4, keep it gritty. And so we came back to them, and as we developed the site plan, really we're accountable to them and making sure that we're designing the site relative to those 4 guidelines. For instance, keeping it gritty, you know, I followed up with one of the graffiti writers and asked, what does gritty mean? And he said, it's, you know, rocks and mud and water and plants. And as he was describing it, it occurred to me that the ecosystem of graffiti intersects with the historic ecosystem of this marsh. And so we proposed removing the bulkheads and reintroducing an intertidal landscape that could help buffer the Pier 18 from storm surge, but also allows the park to migrate upland as the tides continue to rise over the years. So this is where we landed after the concept phase ended. In the middle of the concept phase, we actually brought some early renders back to the graffiti writers, and they tagged their feedback onto the renders. And so we had to decode the tags and integrate that feedback into the developing design. So you can see things like, for instance, we really strengthen this green frame around the edges of the pier. As the pressures come from the sea, they also come from the land, with more condos and more urban development encroaching on the adjacent property around the pier. We wanted to create this buffer to help keep them, you know, feeling like this is a refuge. We designed custom site furnishings, these expansive surfaces for space to create more art. The formal language coming from the Jersey barriers that are already on site. And then during the community engagement, there was a global pandemic. It was crazy. You had to be there. But one of the things that we did was, you know, we can't meet up with people anymore. And so what we learned was that the graffiti writers themselves were making zines. So we made a zine together with them called The Voices of Graffiti Pier. And they would go out and tag the pier, take pictures, send it to us. And then we integrated those photos together with the updates of the design. And you know, there's no mailing list of graffiti writers, so we couldn't just send this out in the mail. We gave each graffiti writer and street artist that we had a relationship with a stack of them, and then they would distribute. So just a few of the renders, you know, that memorialize that the concept design. We found this really beautiful 1923 railing, and it's drawing, but it's not to code, and so a simple kind of mesh fencing allows us to put new railings here and make it safe and accessible without looking safe and accessible, really drawing from the existing language. This is before and this is after. So we're really kind of reinterpreting the pioneering vegetation into a biosoil here. There's selective removal of invasives, upgrading the surfacing to make this ADA accessible. We were proposing stabilized soil here. This is before and this is after. Again, here we are basically reinterpreting some of those pioneering species into a more robust and resilient plant palette, giving it the character of the plants that were there, but making sure the plant palette is resilient and you know, sustainable into the future. So this is before and this is after. This is a shady corner below the trestle actually, we started a new phase of this project, and the street artists and graffiti writers saw this render again, and they're like, this is too pretty. We need to make it uglier. So this will not be this pretty in the next iteration. This is before and this is after. Again, reintroducing some of that plant palette, more robust palette, shade trees, and then our site furnishings. This is on top of the trestle. The one thing they told us, the artists told us not to do, is they were like, whatever you do, don't make it the High Line. So, but we wanted to make it ADA accessible. So what we proposed was cutting basically an ADA ramp into the bed of the trestle. You can see those handrails, guardrails rather, being introduced. And the planting is just sedum and grasses. The paths are gravel and stabilized soil. The seating itself is also more surface for graffiti. Again, keeping with the making it safe and accessible without looking safe and accessible. Pier 20 is falling into the river, and so it's not being used right now. But we worked with Sherwood design engineers to design a way to shore up the structure and actually create a wall to the pier that's taller than the existing pier structure, in order to, again, offer more surfaces for art. And in this way, you can see how it's couched in this intertidal landscape. So as the tide waters rise, the art on the wall will actually be in dialogue and serve as a kind of index as the tides rise. Anyone heard of Columbus, Indiana? Not Columbus, Georgia, not Columbus, Ohio. Okay, a couple people. If you find yourself in southern Indiana, highly recommend going to this town of about 30,000 people. J. Irwin Miller, who was the CEO of Cummins Engineering, which was headquartered there, believed that architecture could make this place the best place to live in America, and that it could heighten people's civic engagement through great architectural design. And so he founded an architectural foundation that would pay for the commissioning of architects from all over the world to come to this town and design things like, the post office and the church and the elementary schools and the library. And so some of the most, basically this town is a museum of modern art, of incredible modern architecture. Part of this legacy includes Millrace Park, which in landscape art, when I was in landscape architecture school, and still today, it's kind of part of the canon, and in part because when it was designed, it was ahead of its time in that it was designed to flood. It was designed by Michael van Valkenburg and Associates. Michael was my professor in school, and this park opened in 1993. So they bring in architects to design installations that keep the legacy alive. So you're meant to design installations that are in dialogue with these architectural gems. My office was commissioned to design an installation there at Millrace Park. In 2022, we started community engagement, and we asked people about the past, present, and future of Millrace Park on its 30th, on the date of its 30th anniversary. We had this big aerial of the map of the park, and we asked people to pin their favorite spot in the park. And if you remember from the image, there's this half moon landform, and so it became a large concentration of pins there, but this large expanse of lawn next to it had nothing. And so we thought that might be an opportunity for a dialogue. When we looked into that half moon form, we were able to talk to Michael about it. He said that it was a nod to the indigenous mound building tradition of the Ohio Hopewell. And in the Ohio Hopewell tradition, these circular mounds were built as spaces of ritual. This was a place to more emphasis on the gathering than burial. And so this was a space actually for civic engagement. And just in the way that J. Irwin Miller talked about architecture's role in the 20th century, this indigenous tradition is very much in the same spirit. And so we started thinking about completing the circle of that half moon to highlight this legacy. These are some early sketches of how we might do this with an installation. There's an official Columbus town red. So we knew already whatever was going to be was going to need to be in red. And we were interested in the kind of synergy that mirroring that form could create. We were interested in the idea of frames. This is us mocking it up one-to-one. What would it look like to complete the circle? When we originally came up with this idea, I was really obsessed with the precision of the form, but this was a small budget, and so we had to think about, we couldn't use metal, for instance. So we decided to use bamboo, and it ended up being my favorite part of the project. The growers actually much of it was grown in Georgia and South Carolina, and the growers came to Columbus and helped us build this together with the community. So here we are painting all the bamboo red. And this, gives you a sense of its position in the landscape. It really ended up, there's a sister city Columbus has a sister city in Japan, and a happy coincidence that this construction method and the color actually elevates that relationship. This is about 100 people here, so you can get a sense of the scale of this. And you can start to see that echoing of the hill form. We wanted something that was open so that, when they have large events, which is what the lawn is typically used for, that it could still be permeable in that way. So you can see here, there was a concert, a Sister Hazel concert. Does anybody remember Sister Hazel? Yeah, I know, Ellen, you and I. So the VIP, it was in the frame. And the thing is really kind of taken on a life of its own. This is movie nights. You can see how the form actually kind of hugs people in the landscape in a place that, before this was really not registering in people's mental maps. We were, very specific about the spacing between the bamboo even, designing for maintenance facilities or maintenance trucks. And so there's a very kind of performance-based approach to designing this piece. Okay, this is a small gem in our home neighborhood of Harlem, New York. This is a recently opened museum, ground up construction. The museum itself has been around since the 1960s, but this is their first ground up construction. And it opened in November of 25. David Ajay was the building architect. The concept for the architectural design was really about the spaces of encounter that make the neighborhood of Harlem what it is. It's stoops, it's the street corners. And so, even within the building, there's this kind of elevation of spaces of encounter. We were commissioned to design a roof garden there. And I really came back to a theme that a lot of Harlem writers and artists and have been tackling over decades, whether Harlem is a real place or whether it's an idea. And I'm really, struck by that, because in a lot of historically African-American communities that I work in, people describe their home neighborhood as the Harlem of, there's probably a Harlem of Atlanta. Yeah. Yeah, maybe not. But this is a common kind of descriptor. And so I really resonated with the idea of Harlem itself being both an idea and a real place. So in the studio, we mapped the history of Harlem as a real place, which you see here down below, and then Harlem as an idea, which you see highlighted in yellow. And what we just came to understand was that the real place influenced the idea, which influenced the place, the idea over time. And any place a plant showed up in that history, we wrote it down. And we didn't know what that would get us, but we were really interested in the idea. So for instance, Aaron Douglas here, in his paintings, he really uses tropical and subtropical plants to form vignettes around the frame. And there's a long history of women in Harlem selling bouquets for their own economic self-sufficiency. And, on the brownstone stoops today, we see things like juniper and Japanese maple. Thelma Golden, the director of the museum, really encouraged us not to think about Harlem just in its history, which people tend to do, but the fact that history is being made every day. What's happening now? What are artists and writers saying about Harlem now? And so, by her encouragement, I was really drawn to Firle Baez's painting here, which really frames the legacy of the garden, not as a space of power. It's not a demonstration of power or of luxury, but that a garden can be a place for social movements and for gathering. And so we translated this into an idea for a garden there. We, thought about the scale of the brownstone and pocketing a planting design at that scale, kind of creating the rhythms that you have when you walk down the street. So we really designed the garden around that module, and each one having its own distinct plant palette. And instead of benches, again, we literally measured the stoop stairs in the neighborhood and, peppered these seats into the garden. And so, this collection, we literally used the plants that emerged through that exercise and brought them all together. Now, you'll never see another garden with banana plants and juniper in the same mix, or dandelions. And, these are it's a very odd mix of plants. And at first we were, kind of unsure about that. But then we realized that is the story of Harlem, that the idea that a neighborhood of 2 square miles could serve as this icon globally for Pan-Africanism. And so the plants themselves weave that story together of Harlem as a place cited here in New York, but bringing together a diaspora of people around the planet. And so this strange mix of plants brings together a really incredible kind of tapestry of textures. And then the stoops really invite you to sit within them. You can see here what happens when you're bringing these plants from all over the diaspora together. And you can see here, for instance, the vignette of Aaron Douglas and the tropical plants kind of framing views from the building out to the street. I'll end with this one last project in upstate New York. Has anyone ever been to Dia? A couple of people, highly recommend. This is a museum that was formed in the 1960s, late 1960s, early 70s, in the midst of the environmental movement. And they wanted to be the counter institution. And so they actually supported some of the most important land art in those decades, and continue to do so. If you've heard of Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, for instance, this is among the works that they steward today. Among the various sites, they also have this museum in Beacon, New York, which sits on the Hudson River, 32-acre site. This is the building, and there are these iconic gardens in the north of the building designed by Robert Irwin. When we were commissioned to design the southern 8 acres that no visitors, no staff had really engaged in. The museum was never designed really to engage with that part of the property. We started by doing some research and found that the site actually used to sit in the floodplain of the Hudson River. And we started to learn about the long history of the site, including brick making, the fact that the building itself was designed as a Nabisco printing facility. This is an interesting, maybe fun fact. This building was built 6 times, the exact same floor plan in different locations, with no regard to its landscape. And so it has an odd relationship to its site. The only thing that changes every time they built it was the skylights always faced north, so that the northern light would help you kind of evaluate the color of the printing on the Nabisco boxes, which makes for a great art museum as well. So in the 1990s, the Dia Art Foundation purchased the property and turned it into this museum. You can see how beautiful these northern gardens are. In 2012, Hurricane Sandy revealed how vulnerable the site was to flooding. Remember, it used to sit in the river. And then 2020, following George Floyd's murder, the kind of coincidence of those two within a few years of each other started to make Dia ask themselves the question that many institutions were asking themselves: can we do things differently, and how? And so, they commissioned us to design this southern landscape to help deal with both. How can a landscape design surface and grapple with the history of the site and of the institution, but also how do we protect ourselves against this ecological vulnerability as well? So this is what the southern landscape that we were working with looked like: flat and lawn. we started to talk to Native people from the area, and in those conversations, they all kind of came back to this phrase or this sentiment that we are all just passing through. They said, you know, in the Western tradition, you name landscape features after people, but in the Native tradition, you name people after landscapes. And that's because we as humans, we're all just passing through. And that'll come back to kind of how we approached the design. We also wanted to take stock of Robert Irwin's approach to the architecture and to the gardens. He was really interested in mimicking or echoing the industrial history, the 20th century history and 19th century history of industry defined by a railroad that basically went page left to page right. And he designed the gallery spaces and the gardens to speak to that industrial history. So you see this gridded nature of the gallery spaces flowing out into the landscape as well. The Native people that we spoke to, they're Wappinger and Lenape, they said, actually, for us, crossing the river is most important. The relationship to the river is the most important. This was the site of portage. So seasonally, when the waters in the river were low, they would cross the river. And that was important to accessing different peoples, different regions, sharing technologies among other various people. And this is an important ritual connected to the site. And, you know, when we heard that, we thought, wow, that's actually the opposite axis of how this space was designed. So this is an early concept sketch that really got us going. But the idea was to design a series of landforms that connect back to the river, that reorient us to the river. And in so doing, we surface the legacy of portage, the tradition of portage, but we also can create these basins that hold water and protect the building from flooding. And so, you know, the expression of water, the visibility of water becomes a part of the experience of the site as well. I love this Toni Morrison quote, and I kept coming back to me as we were designing this. She said, floods is the words they use, but it is not flooding, it is remembering. Remembering where it used to be. All water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was. So we were just bringing the water back to where it was. We were working with clay to think through the sculptural qualities of those landforms, translated that into construction documents. We worked with Sherwood design engineers again on this project to calibrate the volumes of those basins to projections and flooding. So you can see here just how vulnerable the building is. It basically sits in a bathtub. And the ways in which these folds, these berms in the landscape can make water visible, but also protect the building and kind of reduce the watershed adjacent to the building. So at one point when we were talking to Native people about this and we showed them a bunch of historic maps, they said, we don't want to see any more historic maps. You don't need historic maps to understand the history of this place. Go back and look at the ground. Look at the ground. Like you're in your computer, you're in the box, like just go to the ground and look at it and you will see the history of the site there. And sure enough, we went back and these were our notes, just taking stock of remnants of, for instance, the brick and the rail, and all of those chapters are here. This is a series of sketches by, I mentioned, our native Midtown Atlantan in the office. She did these beautiful sketches taking stock of the materials found on the site. And that became our material palette. We said anything we design is going to be using the materials that are on the site. And so that's kind of, again, harkening back to that first project I showed, the question being, this is not a memorial project, but how do the decisions you make tell the history of the place? We worked with Larry Weiner Associates to develop a palette of over 90 native meadow species in these 4 kind of collections of meadows. And really the entire plant palette is telling the ethnobotany of the region. And so you can see in these renders how moving through these landforms really kind of pull you into a journey through the landscape. Each one of these different meadow mixes is calibrated to the level of moisture there. So you can see, for instance, in these smaller kind of ribbons of swales, how the wet meadows emerge as a pattern in the landscape. On the tops of the berms, You have the drier meadows, but you really get this prospect, a kind of promenade effect, and views out into the lower basins on either side. And down in the lower basins, then you get the exuberance of the wet meadows. You know, I love showing this drawing because it's important to know a civil engineer could have done this project. You know, this is an infrastructure project, but what does it mean for a landscape architect or an architect to take on a project like this, to take on an infrastructure project? It means, you know, we are protecting the building with resilience and redundancy baked in. But at the same time, we're also telling stories. We're also designing for program. There are many layers at which this landscape is performing at. And, you know, even in its flooding, this becomes a spectacle and a place to understand over the course of one's own life. You know, it's an invitation to keep coming back and witness the water here. So this was the existing condition, I should say. The project's been under construction for about a year now. And so I thought I'd share some progress images. You can kind of see here the rough grading. You can see how in ways in which even in its rough grading, it's already starting to collect water into small folds. Starting to get some trees in. And this is where we're headed effectively. You know, seasonal expression is a big part of the invitation to keep coming back. And you all are invited to come later this year when it opens. Thank you very much.
There we go. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fabulous. I'm delighted to be able to have a short conversation with you.
Over here.
Exactly. So much to potentially talk about. I mean, a couple of things. One thing that really struck me is how much you leave an incredibly light touch. You know, your designs are so engaged with respecting what's there, and the Dia Beacon, yeah, you got bulldozers out there. It's not totally a light touch, but in general, it feels like you're kind of minimizing your imprint, but you're absolutely helping all of us see this place. So, I mean, especially the graffiti pier, it's as if you didn't want people to notice your work. It's completely about showcasing the place. So part of the question I have is, I think that's a fantastic strategy. Hope everyone's paying attention. But how wide a look do you take when you are researching a place and deciding what it is you want us to see? You know, it seemed like for the graffiti pier, you're looking super close. You're just working with that immediate site. Some of the other project, you know, the Harlem project seemed to be a little almost maybe more at a scale of looking at the whole neighborhood. Are there times when you're looking at the whole city, you know, you're doing research into the native indigenous peoples? Tell us a little about your process of kind of deciding what you're going to research and what is significant and what, you know, you're going to leave behind.
Yeah, it's thank you for witnessing that. I mean, it's tough in a private practice to explain that phase because there's no drawing set for that phase of work. But it's an absolutely important part of our process. We invest a lot in, and sometimes clients understand that and sometimes they don't. And so part of that is also finding clients and projects that want that. You know, for Dia, we competed against, you know, the formidable, you know, competitors in my field. But they all had a sense going in of their kind of scale of work, and, you know, and we came in there and we said, we have no idea we don't know what this project is. We don't know what it's going to be. And we're asking you to trust us in the process and let's figure it out together. And, that helps us find our right partners. But that is, I've grown comfortable with not knowing. I think, yeah, the history of design, we believe that people, architects, designers should be able to come to a place and know what's right. I can smell it. This should go here. This should go there. Blah blah blah. And I don't believe in that. I really hold back and try to toggle to find the scales that feel right. I'm looking for patterns. Patterns take time to emerge. All those conversations, I do things like I listen to music from a place, I hang out at the bar. I guess I've mentioned bars a lot already in this presentation, but in this, is it a football game that everybody goes to? Is there, there's one community, we were working in Toledo, Ohio, and, they said the supermarket on Sunday mornings was like where everybody hangs out. So, just finding the rhythms of the place, socially and spatially and ecologically, it takes time, but I do think it's worth it because you'll end up with a project that nobody could have imagined had they had to make a decision about what it was on day one.
Thank you. Well, and somewhat similarly, another question sort of on just your process. The way that you reinvented community engagement and community narratives is very inspiring. And really, again, sort of the graffiti peers, maybe going to the bars, going to the supermarket. But how do you integrate that into your teaching? I know for myself, my studios always work with real communities, but given student schedules, academic schedules, community schedules, I always feel like I impress upon the students how important it is, but the reality is we're just kind of getting a pretty slim look. Academia just doesn't allow for the depth of the kind of that you're doing in your practice. Any tips?
Yeah, I try not to burden community members with that either. Folks have been overburdened by those conversations, and so what I ask my students to do is to listen to the community in other ways. Is there a Facebook group where they're all talking to each other? Find the hashtags on Instagram or TikTok where, there are all these ways that people are talking to each other. In Graffiti Pier, they were making zines. One can find a zine. How are people fellowshipping with one another already? And just become a part of that. And that could be done in a lot of ways. And sometimes just going to somebody and asking what they want is the easiest way. And maybe we don't have to default to exactly that all the time. And so I think academia is a place to explore other ways of engaging.
So, another thanks. I think your work shows a really, bright light on kind of social blind spots, and working really to elevate sort of past, often neglected histories. And yet it seems like the headlines in landscape architecture lately have really been more dominated by how do we adapt and mitigate climate change. You've been working on the two simultaneously, but it seems like you're not leading us with a story on adapting to climate change, but obviously doing both is an obvious win-win. What advice do you have for cities today at a time when funding for both of those is increasingly being zeroed out?
Wow, tough question. Here's what I think, and this is my optimism, and I'm typically not an optimist, but sometimes it's the only way to keep going. There are some big questions that we have to face in your framing, kind of in both tracks. A lot of that has to do with working in contexts where there's a lot of historic distrust. And so now might be a time to work there. Work in building a vision that when money does come, when funding does come, when support does come, that there is a transect of people that are mobilized around a shared vision. Because building a shared vision takes time, not just money, but time. And so sometimes the money comes fast and we don't have a coalition of people, gathered around a shared vision. So now is the time to build the visions so that when the funding comes, it's go time.
I mean, I would totally agree with that. And I feel like it is interesting to me that the more local in scale you go, the more everyone is willing to work together. It's less bifurcated. You can't always tell whether the mayor is Republican or Democrat. They're interested in helping their city, and they're doing great. They're hopefully doing great things. But on that issue of public-private, thank you for sharing discussion about Olmsted. Can't wait for the book. Many of us here in Atlanta, we have Olmsted, so we have some particular interest. Although the landscape where Olmsted worked in Atlanta have become pretty elite. And I think as you expressed so much better than I can, but still, I think most of us love how Olmsted argued for Central Park on the basis that up until then, it was really only rich people who had access to pleasure parks, these grand estates and things, and that a democracy needed public parks accessible to all. Your work appears to be mostly very much in the public realm, serving and giving voices to localized communities. Do you have any advice for practitioners who are working for private clients on how to either expand the voices in the room or expand access to a greater public?
Yeah, I mean, I think recent years have, well, let me start by saying this. We're working on our first national park, which is exciting, in Ohio. And we work obviously with the National Park Service, but in a time where, there have been government shutdowns and funding is being cut, they've actually, they have doubled down on a really important partnership that they have with a nonprofit. And so we have private institutions that are really fighting for public access to landscape. Some of the most important work for publicly accessible landscapes is happening by private institutions. And I mean, sometimes there are times in our history when it's the opposite. But I've come to understand there's a resilience, a redundancy and a resilience that's important about the private institutions and what they offer people in these shifts in our history. So, DIA is a private institution, and yet when they thought about this 8 acres that they commissioned us to design, they said, you don't buy a ticket. This is something that we are stewarding as a private institution. We are going to steward this land for people to access. And so I think there's an important role for private institutions in this moment, but really in the long history of thinking about shifts in our country and in our politics, that what we think of as private and public working hand in hand is really, I think, our best bet.
Yeah, that sounds good. All right, last question. We're here at Georgia Tech. You're at Harvard. Research is big, and what research topic or topics would you hope that the next generation would explore? What would really help the world that you're trying to achieve? What is it we still don't really know yet? We need more research on.
This kind of harkens back to something that you said about how I think, which is, the question of climate is not just a science question. And in fact, I think there is a latent genius in how we think about culture and how we approach ecology, that historically people for 10, 15,000 years living in North America have lived in sync with nature. And so I think research that opens up that terrain, how do we really grapple with the changes in climate, not in a purely scientific way, but if we open up our lenses, there are many more exemplars for how to craft new ways of living in a more dynamic way. If we open up our references and our minds to a whole planet of Native people that have been doing that for a long time. And so I think there's a lot of innovation and research to think about how do we craft this. And we were talking about Atlanta being the city in the forest. What an incredible ambition, really. And so I think Atlanta could be a place where thinking about urbanism as something that is specifically designed and crafted for this ecology and this place, this terrain. It should look and feel and function completely different than any other place. And I guess it's up to you guys to figure out what that looks like.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I couldn't agree more.
I think we have time for maybe one or two questions. So if someone has a burning question, Ansley will bring the mic to you.
Hey, thank you for your lecture. It was fantastic. Kind of going on what Ellen said about the fine touch that your work seems like it has, how do you kind of resist the urge to over design the site? Do you? I mean, is kind of every planting accounted for? How do you go about that process?
I think it looks like a fine touch, but even Dia is a huge earth moving project. Graffiti Pier, in order to make things look like it was never touched, you actually have to do a lot more work than clearing it and redesigning it. So it's actually a trick of the eye, I suppose. And it's hard for clients to understand, it's going to cost them double for it to look the same. But whether it's something I have to resist, yes. I mean, I was trained as a designer. I think the idea of authorship is something that we're all sold. But I think it's really easy to design something that's beautiful, that like we come out of school with like, this is what a plaza is supposed to more or less look like. This is the scale, it functions like this. This is where, you can kind of stamp those things in different places. I'm actually much more energized by the idea of coming up with something that doesn't have a typology that exists, that looks and functions and feels like something else. So I'm actually, it's not hard for me in the sense that I'm way more inspired by the idea that there's something else that we could design that we haven't really seen before.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. That was really good. I just wanted to ask you, I understand that you're someone who was, let's say, first or second generation immigrant. As someone, I am myself also someone like that, how do you think that affects your career? And how do you think that affects your passion into getting into architecture?
I'm not sure that maybe in an indirect way, in the sense that, my parents immigrated from Ethiopia and they moved to the South. And I grew up in Louisiana, where there was a really palpable culture. And so I always kind of had in the front of my mind the idea of culture and of home and of ritual. And I always looked for connections between Africa in its broadest sense and where I was living in the South. And living in Louisiana, those connections are very, very present. So I kind of grew up with that at the front of my mind, and probably shaped the way that I thought about space. We use space all the time in rituals in Louisiana. So that I think was really important for me. When I was 13, we moved to Houston, and the city is laid out very differently. Space and culture function very differently. And so I started to kind of map onto that space and culture are linked. But I think having culture in my own home and seeing it in the place that I grew up in together really made it feel like this is something that I couldn't separate from the way that I saw the world.
Thank you.
No pressure.
Hey, Sarah, and thank you. You touched on it a little bit in this presentation, but in a previous interview, you talked about the distinction between memory and memorial.
Hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
The answer. Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of a memorial comes from a very specific cultural trajectory, historical trajectory, rooted in classical antiquity and monument as demonstrations of power. And, so then the memorial became that, the memorial as we know it in architectural history. And it's really fashioned around the idea of a specific moment, a date, a war, a battle, a hero. But memory is not about a discrete moment in time. Memory is patterns. It's a palimpsest. It's a collection that's made up over time, and we live it. It's embodied in us. Maybe it's carried through cultural vessels like music and art. And so that's why I kind of think about the spaces we design as places to activate memory, as opposed to designing memorials, which are more like objects on pedestals or demonstrations of power. And so I think thinking about memory and really accepting memory as a living and dynamic thing that we all do every day, that might open up how we think about the design of everyday spaces to make memory present in our everyday lives.